Welcome to Conversations on the Way, Dan.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here, Nana.
Thank you. I'm very pleased you're here. I think that, we've got to have a variety of voices, and that's what we try to do with this show and with these conversations. Let's start by talking about Jewish Voices for Peace. Who is Jewish Voices for Peace, and what are your goals?
Well, Jewish Voice for Peace is, as the name says, a Jewish organization. We are the fastest growing Jewish organization in the United States. And Jewish Voice for Peace organizes for Palestinian freedom and equality. And we organize for Judaism beyond Zionism. Those are the defining goals and principles for Jewish Voice for Peace. And so it is a Jewish organization. We are Jews for Palestinian freedom. We are Jews for Palestinian rights. And we do not believe that Zionism or the state of Israel are central to or defining of Judaism. And in fact, we think that the continuous oppression of Palestinians by Zionism and by the Zionist state, by Israel, is in fact a denigration of our Jewish faith tradition, which is a faith tradition that believes in the sanctity of all human beings.
So, for some people, it's hard for them to grasp everything you've just said. So I definitely want to get into that in a moment. But first, I think it would be interesting for folks to know how you came to be a part of JVP, what you hope to gain, what motivates you to keep at it. I'm sure you've heard plenty of people say, because I've heard plenty of people say, as an ally and supporter and in solidarity with Palestine, that, this is just a lost cause and give it up. And, it's been
Yeah.
complicated for 2,000 years and all the things that you normally hear. So, how did you come to this work and what motivates you to keep going?
Well, first of all, let me say this is not a 2,000-year conflict. That is and I say this as a historian, somebody who teaches history, has taught history at the Claremont colleges for the past, I guess, 38 years. I think that's correct. Since 1980, maybe it's 37, since 1986. In fact, that's a profound mistaken confusion. And what does it do? It tells us this conflict has been there forever. And that's exactly to discourage us from trying to end the conflict. The conflict is historical and very recent. Zionism, the idea that there ought to be a state that privileges Jews at the expense of non-Jews, is an idea that only emerges at the end of the 1800s. It doesn't really get established and institutionalized, even as a movement until the 1900s. And it's really only about 100 to 120 years that, unfortunately, there are Zionist settlers who go to Palestine and engage in settler colonialism, much like, white Europeans came to North America and engaged in settler colonialism. In both cases, there was a land with people, not an empty continent, not a land without people. And in both cases, what settler colonialists did was to appropriate land and to eliminate the indigenous people. In both cases, it's wrong. In both cases, liberation, collective liberation, requires that we work to remedy these historic wrongs. So it is absolutely not a 2,000-year problem. It's a recent problem. We should not be discouraged. We should know that it is of recent making and it can be of unmaking in the foreseeable future. And in terms of personal discouragement, I mean, it's nobody can feel encouraged today with the loss of life. And we in Jewish Voice for Peace, that this is very important to myself as a Jew, I grieve for every life lost Jewish, Israeli, or Palestinian. I grieve for every life lost, and understanding that the root cause of the lives being lost is the oppression of Palestinians doesn't in any way diminish my grief for the Jewish Israelis' lives that are lost. But in terms of my personal relationship, um, I was brought up in a household that had, and particularly by my mother, the principle of human equality, that we didn't always know how, but it was our responsibility to pursue treating every life as of equal value. We were keenly aware of the racism in the United States that treated Black lives and brown lives as lesser than our lives as white people. And that was a struggle to resist that. And the same principles my mother applied in the 60s and 70s when I was a kid growing up to the conflicts between the Israeli state and Palestinians. I'm not sure my mother's gone, and I can't ask her. I'm not even sure if she knew the word Palestinian. She may have used what was the common word that non-Palestinians would have used, just use the more generic term Arabs. And Palestinians, identify as Arab, but they identify specifically as Palestinians and Palestinian Arabs. I don't know that she knew the word Palestinian or maybe I'm sure she knew the word Palestine. But what she knew was that we never should treat some human lives with one identity as more than other human lives with another identity. So I can remember her in family gatherings, weddings, and bar mitzvahs, listening to extended Jewish family or relatives talk about the situation in the Middle East in terms of, what it meant for Jews and leaving out what it meant for non-Jews, for the Arabs, for people who would identify as Palestinian. And I remember my mother, I think I was maybe 10 or 11, saying, she one more time heard people say, what does this mean for the Jews? And didn't ask equally what it meant for the other human beings, that she was simply going to lose it and start, that she couldn't hold it together anymore with that kind of asymmetrical treatment of some lives is more important than others. So now, we're talking late 60s, early 70s. I go off to college in the early 70s. And, when my closest friend and I would have a Passover Seder, we would skip through the parts that were Zionist in the Seder, that had been put in by Zionists into the Seder. We eliminated them. We made it very clear that we understood the references to Israel and Jerusalem to be conceptual rather than geographic, and certainly not a state. And I tried to learn, and it was very hard because there wasn't a lot of courses or activities or events, but I tried to learn and listen to Palestinian voices. And I tried in the 70s and 80s to find particularly Jewish identified organizations that were pro-Palestinian and pro-peace, and they didn't exist. And, this gets to your question about why I'm not discouraged. Jewish Voice for Peace, I don't have the exact date. We both can look it up. But roughly at the beginning of the century, Jewish Voice for Peace is founded. And as soon as it was founded, I felt like this was my political home and my Jewish home, that this was the kind of organization I'd been looking for really since the 70s when I went off to college, that it was a fiercely proudly Jewish organization that was committed to doing everything for the liberation of Palestinians. And it's been very important to me ever since. But it is encouraging rather than discouraging that unlike 50, 60 years ago, there was no such organization. Now there is. It is large, it is fast growing, and that gives me hope because I think we can change US policy, US funding for the apartheid, U.S. funding for the ethnic cleansing, U.S. funding for the settler colonialism, U.S. funding for the crippling siege on Gaza that's been in place for 16 years. We can change it because Jews of conscience, social justice Jews, are saying, not in our name, this is not Judaism. And we are speaking effectively, particularly to younger Jews. Today, a larger percentage of Jews under 30 say they support the freedom and equality for Palestinians on many scores, more firmly and forcefully than they are committed to the state of Israel. So particularly in the last quarter century, we have been winning the debate. We're winning hearts and minds. And that gives me great hope. The other part, of course, is we haven't been winning them fast enough. And there is a murderous war going on and lives are being lost. So that is terrible. That is discouraging. But when I think about this situation over my lifetime, we are a growing force for human equality for all there, for Jewish Israelis and Palestinians. And that transition has happened amongst Jews in this country. It's also happening amongst voters who identify as Democrats. Notice I said voters, not the politicians. For the first time, a bigger percentage of voters who identify as Democrats have a stronger, say they more strongly support the Palestinian cause than the state of Israel. Unfortunately, the mainstream Democratic Party hasn't figured it out. Joe Biden, Chuck Schumer, the leadership in the House are still in a mode of supporting Israel regardless of its crimes against our Palestinian sisters and brothers. We only have a small group of real social justice Democrats, Cori Bush and Rashida Tlaib, most particularly. There are others who are close, Jamal Bowman, but particularly Cori Bush and Rashida Tlaib. But that's what gives me hope.
No, that's a lot to give hope. And I really thank you for that, because I think that it's very easy, particularly because you have so many electeds that, are Democrats or call themselves liberals, even progressives. So much of the media, you have to hunt to find media that is just not completely pro-Zionist. It is so hard to do. And they clearly are not speaking often to Jewish folks of conscience that you're talking to, right? They're like handpicking who it is they're having the conversation with. And so it just gives this impression, I have friends and relatives all over the world coming from Ghana originally, who just have this impression that the U.S. and that people in the U.S. are staunchly behind what's happening and, are cool with the genocidal plans that have been publicly announced at this point. Of course, they've been in operation, but publicly announced during this week. And that's why I think it is so important to have a group like Jewish Voice for Peace and to have people pouring into the streets as they did in cities all over this country, making it clear that no, folks are not, in spite of Governor Hochul and Mayor Adams, that all New Yorkers are not saying eliminate Palestinians off the planet in the name of the state of Israel.
And certainly not all Jews. And when I read in the media that the Jewish community rallied for Israel, I say, what am I? And I say, no, that's not the Jewish community. That's the Zionist community. And you need to stop misusing the term Jewish. And you need to name what is Zionist, and leave Jewish and Judaism for the religion and the people, and recognize that a significant number of us and a growing number of us and a larger plurality of us under 30 take Palestinian rights very seriously. That is a huge change. The media is not registering it. Some people, like Peter Beinart, a very important Jewish thinker, has been writing about it since over now 10, 12 years, There's a very important movie out that I encourage people to see called Israelism, just released a new documentary that is a documentary about the way young Jewish Americans are raised to support Israel uncritically, unthinkingly, unquestioningly, no matter how violently and how awfully the Israeli state oppresses Palestinians. It's a very important movie, Israelism. Um, and what it shows is both that that socialization encourages a toxic love for a state, a toxic love for an apartheid state, but it also shows that increasing percentages of young Jewish Americans are saying, not in our name.
Yes.
And I
Yes.
want to I want to mention one more thing. Sorry to interrupt you,
No,
but
of course.
right,
No, of
right.
course.
Um, it's 4:50. We're the day we're speaking in Los Angeles later today, starting at 6 o'clock. There will be a group of Jews from Los Angeles, organized by another Jewish organization that in many ways supports Palestinian rights. I would say not quite as consistently as Jewish Voice for Peace, but very importantly, another very good organization, If Not Now. And If Not Now is organizing at 6 p.m. tonight in Bryant Park, I believe, a Jewish mourners Kaddish for all lives lost at this time. And this will be a Kaddish that will be said collectively for the Palestinians and the Jewish Israelis. And I think that that's important. That is our Jewish community. The people who are only concerned about the Jewish Israeli lives lost. That's not our Jewish community. That's our Zionist community.
Now, thank you for that. Thank you for sharing both the film and the event that's happening later on. That, two very important energy piercers. I talk a lot about energy on this show and the need for us to pierce the energy, right, with a different energy that can move things in the direction that we want to move it in. I think about BDS, boycott, divest, sanction, and think about, I'm old as dirt and twice as funky, and was part of the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa that, of course, was always also talking about the liberation of Palestine. And it is heartwarming that in spite of all of their efforts to criminalize darn near and to reject folks because they are in support of BDS, that you still see that movement growing and moving.
I agree entirely, right? People today who don't like the violent uprising, the violent resistance to oppression. And let us understand that when you oppress people, they will resist. Palestinians have been oppressed by the Israeli state. They will resist. They are resisting. They have resisted. Some of that resistance, not all of it, some of that resistance will at some times be violent resistance. And violent resistance costs human lives. If you don't like that, then you need to support nonviolent resistance. And people who oppose nonviolent resistance are the greatest acolytes of violence. And all the people who've been opposing BDS is nonviolent. Boycott, divestment, and sanctions. It is what the ANC asked for in relationship to white South African apartheid. The boycott parts of it is exactly what so many great victories for African American rights in this country, right? The Reverend Martin Luther King led boycotts. Boycotts are nonviolent. Divestment is nonviolent. Sanctions is not violent. You oppose that, you must love violence, because if you oppose that, the resistance to oppression you're going to get is violent resistance. And so anybody who really dislikes violence, anybody who really thinks violence should be a last resort, should join us in supporting BDS, boycotts, divestments, and sanction. This past summer, the American Anthropological Association, one of the largest, learned societies in North America adopted a BDS resolution. We are boycotting Israeli universities. In Claremont, at the colleges, particularly at Pitzer College, we have an ongoing campaign. The campaign is a response to all of the Palestinian civil society groups that have called now throughout this century for global social justice allies to support their pursuit of freedom and equality by adopting BDS. And so our campaign is to suspend Pitzer's study abroad programs with Israeli universities. That is nonviolent. Those universities are significant factors in the securitization and in the oppression, in the discrimination against Palestinians. And our campaign is to respond to the call for BDS from Palestine by adopting a suspension of all study abroad programs in Israel. A call for BDS is like a picket line. When you approach and get to a picket line set up by oppressed workers, you face the choice of whether you honor it or trample it. That is the choice that all of us face. Palestinians have set up a BDS picket line. We either honor it or we trample it. And my view is that decent people don't cross picket lines and decent people don't cross BDS.
Yeah, decent people do not cross BDS. Jewish Voice for Peace also issued a statement on the recent violence in Israel and the continuing violence in Palestine. Why was that important for JVP? And what do you hope people take away from your statement?
We hope that people take away that this violence didn't start when Hamas launched its attacks. This violence started when Zionism started settler colonialism at the expense of Palestinian peoples. We hope people take away that the root cause of this violence is the oppression. The root cause of this violence is the state oppression of Palestinians. And it's important for some of the reasons you said. It's important for people to understand that the support for the oppressive state is not a Jewish position. That support is a Zionist position. And it's important for Palestinians, important for Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, important for all Americans to understand that there is nothing anti-Jewish about criticizing Zionism. Anti-Zionism is not the least bit anti-Semitic. And we as Jews have a historic obligation to be vocal in these ways. I think because given that the oppression is taking place in our name, we have to take responsibility for rejecting this weaponization of anti-Semitism. And if we don't, we are failing to support the freedom and equality of Palestinians. We in Jewish Voice for Peace vigorously oppose anti-Semitism, but we oppose anti-Semitism as part of collective liberation. In solidarity, we understand that we're not safe and we're not secure and we're not fully free unless Palestinians are safe and secure and free. And so we pursue freedom and security for Jews through collective liberation.
And I want to talk a little bit more about that, the understanding that folks cannot be at peace while there is all of this violence, while there is all of the underlying and root causes of the violence. I mean, one of the things that is so disturbing to me is that I feel like some of why people don't want to look at what the Zionist state means, what it has done, how it was founded, how it has, maintained itself, how it has expanded, is they just want to be comfortable. I mean, we're complicit. Our tax money is going there. There's all these things that are happening. And I think there's a part of people that just wants to feel like we're on the side with the cowboys with the white hats and all is well.
Yeah, well, it is hard. it is hard to resist what is dominant, settled opinion. Um, but we have to, think, and I think the analogies are very important. Too many white Americans are fearful and are shaped by racism. And they imagine that they can be more secure if there's more policing of brown and black communities. But the hyper policing of brown and black communities doesn't make anybody safe. It leads to murder by the police of brown and black people. It leads to hyper incarceration. And I haven't noticed that it actually reduces risks in any way to white people. Similarly, Jewish Israelis think that they're going to be safe by having more guns and more soldiers. But escalating, weapons and ways of policing and murdering other people doesn't ever succeed in making you safe. There is safety through solidarity. There is safety through equality. When you have an equal society, you have a society that can genuinely be peaceful and safe for everybody. So we have to promote social justice, social equality, demilitarization, depoliticization, if that's a word. And we have to get past the idea that the way to be safe is to have more and bigger guns than some other group. Our safety, our freedom cannot be at the expense of anybody else's endangerment and anybody else's denial of freedom.
Absolutely. And I mean, and at the end of the day, it ends up being false. I mean, you have an Iron Dome and people use hang gliders. You know what I'm saying? Like at the
Yep.
end of the day, over and over again, we see that all this big guns and policing and everything you think is going to happen, but that's not actually what ends anything. And what we see ends all, whether we're talking about intercommunal violence, whether we're talking about violence between nations, is actual efforts at peace and diplomacy, investing in the things that people need and deserve. I mean, this is the things that work.
Yep. And everybody and everybody in the world, including the Israeli state, thought that they had managed to gun up and Iron Dome up and militarize up, and that they, had somehow, escaped the principle that you just said and thought, well, we've done it. We've created safety through militarization. And, what's the last couple of days show is that it may have taken long. It may have taken several years. It wasn't instant, but it was 16 years of the siege of Gaza. And it happened. At some point, all that military hardware, all that securitization, all that control over every movement in and out of Gaza, it failed. And people, it showed that this wasn't creating safety for Jewish Israelis. I want Jewish Israelis to be safe. I want Palestinians to be safe. This kind of militarization and a state that is an ethnic supremacist state, as Israel is, this kind of militarization and having a state that treats some lives as lesser than other lives, in the end, is unsafe for everybody. One of the greatest sources of danger to Jews in the world is the Israeli state. And one of the things that makes it very hard to fight anti-Semitism is all the false crying wolf claims that criticizing Israel is anti-Semitic. When you do that, and then real anti-Semitism appears, as it did in Charlottesville, as it did in Pittsburgh, since you've cried wolf, it's very hard to fight the real thing. I really want to end, or I think we're close to the end of our time here, but we have to pursue security and safety through collective liberation.
Absolutely. Okay, quickly. I have a couple of questions. We only have like a couple of minutes, so we'll see what we can do. But speaking of that, I mean, I think when I was younger, I was like a two-state solution person because, that's what everyone was talking about. And I really have come to really, and not just with respect to Palestine, just like the world, like come to this understanding that, this idea that we can manage this type of conflicts, particularly with violence, is just not doesn't make sense to me. And I really am sort of converted to this pluralistic, multi-religious, multi-ethnic, one-state solution that I know to folks sounds like a pipe dream, but that's where I am. And wondering if JVP has a position on this issue. I think it's going to be hard with all that's happened now, but then I think to myself, I look around the world and I say, yeah, there's been a lot of hard that people have been able to do. What are your thoughts?
Well, let me say something about JVP's position and then some personal thoughts I have as a Jew, as somebody committed to social justice, and as a JVP member, but not as a spokesperson on this. JVP recognizes that it exists as an organization that is an ally to Palestinians, and it's an ally to Jewish Israelis who pursue peace as well. But we don't live there. And so we think that it is not our place as outsiders to dictate a particular solution or even endorse it. We are very clear that any solution, any peaceful solution, any peaceful outcome has to be based on principles of full equality and full freedom for everybody, and that in this case must include for Palestinians the right of return. But it's not Jewish Voice for Peace's role to say whether that should be one state, two states, 23 and a half states, or no states. So, and that's a principle that outsiders have to respect, the capacity of people on the ground to work out a solution. And I think that is very important, that we don't say to people, well, we know, you mentioned that you have, I think, family and ancestry in Ghana. US Americans shouldn't say to Ghana, this is the solution to your problems. We want to stop funding things that undermine democracy in Africa, but we don't tell Africans how to solve and run their societies. So that's, I think, the Jewish Voice for Peace position. It's an anti-colonial position. It recognizes that people have to have self-determination, means that outsiders don't tell them what's best for themselves. That said, I think we also, and again, I think we can also observe that the support for Zionist settlements throughout the West Bank mean that realistically, there's no two-state solution left. I don't know how you would, you've chopped up the West Bank like Swiss cheese and settled several 100,000 Zionist settlers in the midst of the West Bank. There's no contiguous Palestinian territory. So one does, along with saying that whatever people in the region agree to that involves equality and freedom and social justice, we should support. One also can say, as an observer, and I say this as a scholar, it's pie in the sky. You want to talk about what's unrealistic. The two-state solution is unrealistic. When, I say it's like thinking there's going to be two states after what's gone on in the last quarter century is like imagining that Palestinians are going to sprout wings and fly over the apartheid wall. Neither of those are going to happen. And we also have to say that given that it's so unrealistic, it's such a delusional fantasy, that the United States official policy and leading politicians just saying over and over again that they support the two-state solution, and that shows that they have some concern for Palestinian rights, that's just their alibi. The mantra of supporting the two-state solution has become a mask for doing nothing to support freedom and equality, nothing to support nonviolent resistance to oppression. So it's not JVP's place nor my place to tell Palestinians and Jewish Israelis how to organize their life. But I think it is fair to say that when so many US political leaders repeat the two-state mantra, it's a mask, or, it's like those curtains that the Oz hides behind, that are really disguising the fact that they're pretending to say they support something that might work for Palestinians when it's just completely empty. And they instead should support BDS, and they should stop funding the apartheid. They should stop sending $3.8 billion a year that, for instance, is used to put any time a Palestinian child in the West Bank is taken into custody, they are placed in military detention by the Israeli state. And that is on our dime, that we are funding that. And, instead of talking two-state, end the funding and let Palestinians and Israelis work this out for themselves.
I love that. I love that. Last piece, fill in the blank. We need to let go of the notion of blank and lean into blank to be more free in 2023 and beyond. I'm going to read it one more time. We need to let go of the notion of blank and lean into blank to be more free in 2023 and beyond.
We need to let go of the notion of safety through state power and dominating others. And we need to lean into the notion of safety through solidarity.
All right. Thank you so much. How do people get in touch with you and Jewish Voice for Peace if they want more information or if they want to support?
Jewish Voice for Peace, very simple. Google and you'll get our webpage. If you want to get in touch with me, please email me. I will give you my email. It is DSEGAL@pitzer.edu.
Excellent. Thank you so very much for your time. Really appreciate you.
I appreciate you. Looking forward.